Deborah Voss tore the $5 million check clean in half, right in front of an 8-year-old girl. "Men like you don't walk in here with this kind of money," she said, looking Marcus Reed up and down like something she'd scraped off the bottom of her shoe. Then she picked up the phone and called the police to report fraud. Marcus pulled his daughter close. He looked at Deborah, calm as still water, and told her she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Security moved in to walk him toward the door. His daughter's small fists were wrapped so tightly around his sleeve her knuckles had gone white. Then the glass door swung open, and a man in a gray suit walked in carrying a leather briefcase, stopped cold at the sight of torn paper scattered across the tile floor, and went pale. "Mr. Reed," he said, his voice cracking the entire lobby wide open. "Why is this happening?" Before we get into how a $5 million check ended up in pieces on a bank floor, and how 4 words from a stranger flipped that entire room upside down in under 10 seconds, if stories like this one hit home for you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Marcus Reed had learned a long time ago that most rooms made up their mind about a man before he ever opened his mouth. He was 41 years old, and for the last 6 years he had been raising his daughter alone in a quiet house on the edge of Millbrook, a town small enough that nobody looked twice at his 14-year-old sedan or the navy jacket he'd owned since before Amara was born. His wife had left them both 3 years earlier, chasing a different life in a city 2 states away, and Marcus had done the only thing that ever made sense to him afterward. He kept going. He drove Amara to school every morning. He cooked dinner every night, usually something simple, because simple was what fit into the hours he actually had. He had never once missed a school recital or a parent-teacher meeting, not even during the stretch 2 winters back, when work kept him awake past 2 in the morning 3 nights a week straight. Nobody at Amara's school knew that the man who showed up in a faded jacket to watch her sing in the winter concert had built Reed Capital Partners from a folding table in a rented office into a firm that managed billions of dollars for pension funds, universities, and family trusts across the Midwest. Marcus preferred it that way. He had grown up the son of a mother who cleaned office buildings at night and a father who drove a delivery truck for 31 years without ever once calling in sick, and he had absorbed, from both of them, a suspicion of anything that looked like showing off. He did not want his daughter growing up believing that money made a person important, or that a man's worth could be read off the label stitched into his coat. He wore the same watch he'd worn for 11 years, a plain steel thing with a cracked crystal he'd never bothered to fix. He drove the same used sedan he'd bought with cash the year Amara was born. He kept his success folded quietly into the background of an ordinary life, visible only to the small circle of people who actually needed to know it existed. His father had driven the same delivery route for 31 years, the kind of job where a man learned to read weather and traffic and the moods of strangers all at once, and had never once missed a shift, not for a cold, not for a funeral, not for the birth of his only son. His mother had cleaned 3 different office buildings downtown on the overnight shift, coming home just as Marcus was leaving for school, the 2 of them trading a kitchen and a set of keys like relay runners who rarely got to see each other's faces except in passing. Marcus had grown up understanding, in a way that never fully left him, that dignity and money were 2 entirely separate currencies, and that a man could be rich in one while poor in the other, or the reverse, and the world would judge him almost entirely by the wrong one. He'd built Reed Capital out of a folding table and a second-hand laptop in a rented room above a hardware store, the same year Amar was born, working nights after his day job at a regional investment firm where he'd spent 6 years learning the business from men who never once suggested he might run his own version of it someday. He'd built it slowly, the way anything worth trusting gets built, one client relationship at a time, one careful decision at a time, refusing every shortcut that might have grown the firm faster, but left it standing on something less solid. His wife, Danielle, had been there for the folding table years, working double shifts as a hospital administrator to keep the lights on while Marcus poured every spare hour into firm. She left 3 years into Amara's life, not out of malice. Marcus had come to understand with time, but out of a restlessness that had never really been about him or their daughter at all. She had wanted a different kind of life, in a different city, and had eventually gone to find it, leaving Marcus to raise their daughter largely alone while the firm he'd built with her beside him for the hardest years finally began to grow into something that mattered. He never spoke badly of her in front of Amara. He answered his daughter's occasional questions about her mother honestly and gently, without bitterness, because he understood that bitterness was a weight he had no right to hand down to a child who hadn't chosen any of it. What he gave her instead was consistency, a father who showed up every single day in the exact same steady way, so that whatever she eventually came to understand about the mother who left, she would never once have to wonder about the father who stayed. Charles Whitfield had not always intended to spend his career defending a bank's reputation. He had started 30 years earlier as a loan officer in a small branch outside Detroit, and he still remembered, more clearly than he liked to admit, watching an older colleague deny a mortgage application to a black schoolteacher with a stronger credit file than the white contractor approve an hour later at the same desk. He had said nothing that day, 26 years old, and knew enough to the job that speaking up felt like a risk he wasn't sure he could afford. He had told himself, the way so many people in that Millbrook lobby would tell themselves decades later, that it wasn't his place, that questioning a superior wasn't worth what it might cost him. He had carried that silence for 3 decades, promotion after promotion, boardroom after boardroom, and had never quite found the moment to make peace with it. Standing in the Millbrook lobby watching Marcus Reed hold his daughter against his side, Charles had felt something crack open in him that had stayed sealed for 26 years, a recognition so immediate and so physical that his briefcase had slipped out of his hand before his mind had even fully processed why. He never told Marcus that story directly, but it sat behind every decision he made in the weeks that followed, every phone call with the board, every refusal to let the matter be quietly settled and buried. He was not simply protecting a business relationship worth $750 million. He was, in his own private way, finally answering for a silence that had followed him for most of his adult life. That particular Tuesday morning, a check for $5 million had cleared into Marcus's hands, the proceeds of an early stake he had taken years earlier in a small logistics software company that most people had never heard of until it went public and made headlines that spring. Marcus already knew exactly where the money was going before the ink on the check had even dried. Half of it would go into a trust for Amara, untouched until she was old enough to understand what it meant and old enough, he hoped, to have already learned from watching him that money was never the point of anything. The other half was meant to see the scholarship fund for children being raised by a single mother or a single father, the kind of family he understood in his bones, having lived every version of the particular exhaustion that came with it. He brought Amara along that morning, because they had a plan for the rest of the day, one she'd been talking about since breakfast with the specific excitement only an 8-year-old can bring to a Tuesday. First the bank, then the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on 5th Street, where she liked the grilled cheese cut into triangles instead of squares. It was supposed to be the easiest stop of the entire afternoon, a formality, 10 minutes at most, before the two of them got back to simply being father and daughter instead of founder and dependent. Neither of them expected the visit to take more than 10 minutes. Marcus had even promised Amara she could pick out 3 books instead of the usual one, since he was in an unusually good mood that morning, humming along to the radio the whole drive over. They walked into the Millbrook branch of Continental Trust Bank not long before closing time, the same branch Marcus had used for 15 years, since before Amara was born, since before Reed Capital had a name anyone outside a small circle of investors would have recognized. The woman behind the manager's desk that day, Deborah Voss, had transferred to that branch only a few weeks earlier. She did not know his history. She had never once pulled up his account. She had no idea that the man standing in front of her in a worn jacket had been a fixture in that building's ledgers for a decade and a half, long before she had ever set foot inside it. Deborah had come to Millbrook under pressure of her own, though excused nothing that followed. Her previous branch had missed its quarterly fraud prevention targets 2 quarters running, and regional leadership had made clear, in the vague, deniable language corporate offices tend to use, that her transfer came with an expectation that Millbrook's numbers would look sharper by year's end. She had absorbed that pressure the way people sometimes do, by narrowing her sense of who counted as a risk until the definition had quietly, and without her ever fully admitting it to herself, become a stand-in for who looked like they belonged and who didn't. It was not a policy written down anywhere. It was worse than that. It was a habit of mind so old and so well rewarded over the years that she had stopped recognizing it as a choice at all. None of that made what happened next forgivable. It only made it, in the end, entirely human, which was in some ways a harder truth to sit within if she had simply been cruel for its own sake. Deborah's eyes moved over Marcus the moment he walked through the door, down to Amara beside him, then out through the front windows to the sedan parked at the curb. Other customers who came through in press suits that afternoon were greeted before they'd even crossed the lobby. Marcus and his daughter stood waiting while 3 tellers stayed idle behind the counter. None of them called him forward. Amara tugged at her father's sleeve and asked, quietly, why nobody was helping them yet. Marcus told her to be patient. He told her it never paid to assume the worst about people before they'd done anything to earn it. He had no idea, standing there in that quiet lobby with his daughter's hand in his, how badly that particular kindness was about to be tested. When Marcus finally reached the counter, he placed a check down and asked for it to be deposited into the account he had held there for 15 years. The number printed on the check caught the teller's attention immediately, and within seconds Deborah had stepped in behind the counter herself. Instead of pulling up his account history, something any manager at that bank could have done in under a minute, she began questioning him loudly enough that half the lobby could hear every word. Where had the money come from? What did he do for a living? Did he have documentation? Marcus answered every question without losing his composure. The same steady patience he'd used all his life in rooms that assumed the worst about him before giving him a chance to prove otherwise. He handed over his driver's license, his bank card, his account number, and the paperwork confirming the sale of his shares. He offered to let Deborah call the issuing bank directly so she could verify everything herself within minutes. By any reasonable standard, it was more than enough for a transaction that should have taken no time at all. Deborah looked at the documents without really looking at them. A man carrying a $5 million check, she said, loud enough for the row of chairs by the window to hear, doesn't drive a car like yours, or wear a coat like that. A young teller named Renee Castillo offered to make the verification call herself. Deborah cut her off before she could reach for the phone, ordering her back to her own station in a tone that left no room for discussion. By then, several customers had noticed the tension building at the counter. A few had already lifted their phones to record. One man near the entrance said, loud enough for Amara to hear clearly, that a man like Marcus was probably using his own daughter to make a scam look more convincing. Nobody in the lobby spoke up against the comment. They simply kept their phones raised, waiting to see what happened next, the way people wait for weather instead of stepping in to change it. Amara's hand found her father's and gripped it tight, her earlier confidence draining out of her all at once. Marcus kept his voice even and asked Deborah, one more time, to please make the call to the issuing bank before this went any further. His calm only seemed to provoke her further. She announced to the tellers, the security guard, and every customer still filming that the check was fraudulent, though she had not verified a single detail of it. Marcus reminded her, evenly, that she was handling a customer's legitimate assets and should think carefully about what she did next, hoping the warning would land before things went any further. Deborah heard the warning as a threat instead. She snatched the check off the counter, looked directly at Marcus, and said the words that would end up on national television by the following morning. People like you don't walk in here with this kind of money. Then she tore it in half, and then into smaller pieces, and let them fall to the floor at his feet, in full view of his daughter. The lobby went completely silent. Amara bent down as if to gather the torn pieces herself, but Marcus stopped her gently, unwilling to let his daughter kneel on a bank floor to collect what a stranger had just used to humiliate him. He looked at Deborah, kept his voice level, and told her she had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. Deborah picked up the phone and called the police, telling the dispatcher that a man was using fraudulent documents, threatening staff, and refusing to leave the premises. Then she turned to the branch's security guard, a heavy-set man named Owen Bryce, and ordered him to escort Marcus out of the building. Owen hesitated for a moment, visibly uncertain why he was being asked to remove a man who had done nothing but stand quietly at a counter. But a direct order from his manager, delivered in front of a lobby full of witnesses, left him little room to argue. Amara looked up at her father as the guard approached, her eyes wide with fear no 8-year-old should have had to carry into a bank on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. There was one moment, easy to miss in the chaos of everything that followed, that Marcus would think about often the weeks after. An older woman sitting near the window, waiting for her own number to be called, had lowered her magazine the moment Deborah raised her voice, watching the entire exchange over the rim of her reading glasses with an expression that shifted slowly from curiosity to something closer to recognition. She did not say anything. She did not raise her phone like the others. But when Owen's hand finally settled on Marcus's shoulder, she stood up from her chair, walked to the counter, and asked Deborah, in a voice far quieter than the moment seemed to call for, whether she had actually called the number printed on the check to verify it. Deborah told her to sit back down, that this was not her concern. The woman did not sit back down. She stood there a moment longer, looked at Amara, and then quietly returned to her seat, her magazine forgotten in her lap. It was not a dramatic gesture. It did not stop what happened next. But Marcus noticed it, the same way he noticed everything in the room that had decided, almost unanimously, to look away. And he carried the memory of that one small refusal to fully look away with him longer than he expected to. Owen's grip stayed light on Marcus's arm as they moved toward the glass doors, but Mara could not stop looking back at the torn pieces of the check still scattered across the tile. She wrapped both arms around her father's waist, pressed her face into his side, and begged the guard in a small voice not to take him away. Owen's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, caught between the manager's order and the plain evidence sitting right in front of his own eyes. Deborah called out from behind the counter, telling one of the tellers to hold Amara back so the girl couldn't, as she put it, obstruct an officer of the bank from doing his job. It was the first time Marcus's calm cracked. He had absorbed the accusations about the check, the insults about his car and his coat, even the humiliation of watching his own money torn apart in front of strangers. But the moment someone suggested touching his daughter, his voice changed entirely. "No one," he said, "is putting a hand on my daughter." Deborah seized on a reaction immediately, telling the gathering crowd that his sudden intensity was proof of exactly the aggression she'd been warning them about since he walked through the door. Marcus understood, in that instant, that every word out of his mouth and every motion of his body was being read through a lens that had already decided who he was before he'd ever said a word. He lowered his voice, kept his hands visible at his sides, and pulled Amara in close against his hip, away from the guard who had come to take him toward the exit. It struck him, standing there, how quickly a father's instinct to protect his child could be twisted into evidence against him. He had spent 6 years building a life where Amara never once had to watch him lose his composure. And now a stranger behind a bank counter was rewriting that same protectiveness into something dangerous, simply because it suited a story she had already decided to tell about him before he'd ever opened his mouth. Renee spoke up again, the second time she'd tried to intervene since the confrontation began. She reminded Deborah, as steadily as she could manage, that Marcus hadn't threatened anyone, and that a single phone call to the issuing bank would settle the entire matter within minutes. Deborah turned on her instead, threatening to fire her on the spot if she said another word in front of customers who were still recording every second of it. Renee didn't back down entirely, but she stopped talking, aware that losing her job would help no one in that lobby, least of all the man standing beside his frightened daughter. She glanced at Marcus for a moment, and something in her expression suggested she believed him completely, even if she couldn't say so out loud without risking her position. Renee had only worked at the branch a little over a year. She'd watched Deborah dismiss more than one customer in ways that never quite sat right with her, and had told herself each time that it wasn't her place to say anything, that questioning a manager risked more than it was worth. Standing there watching Amara's face crumple, she understood that whatever she had told herself before no longer held up. The customers recording on their phones kept recording. Nobody lowered a phone to speak up. Nobody stepped between Deborah and the family she was dismantling in the middle of an ordinary weekday afternoon. They wanted the spectacle. None of them wanted to be the first person to risk anything by standing on the side of a stranger they'd never met before that day. Amara looked around the lobby at all the raised phones and lowered eyes and asked her father, in a voice just loud enough to carry, why nobody would say he'd done nothing wrong. Several people looked away when she said it. Nobody answered her. Nobody moved. Marcus felt that silence settle into his chest harder than anything Deborah had said, because he understood, watching his daughter's face, that she was learning something about the world that no 8-year-old should have to learn in a bank lobby on an otherwise ordinary Tuesday. He realized, standing there with Amara's hand locked in his, that this had stopped being only about $5 million, or even about his own dignity. His daughter was watching an entire room agree, through nothing but silence, that an injustice happening in plain sight did not require anyone in that room to do a single thing about it. That thought settled into him with more weight than the accusation of fraud ever could. Owen began walking Marcus and Amara toward the glass doors at the front of the branch, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder rather than gripping it, as though some part of him did not want to be doing this even while he did it. The lobby had gone quiet except for the murmur of customers still filming, waiting to see how the scene would end, and the low hum of the overhead lights that suddenly seemed far too loud. Marcus counted his steps toward the door the way he sometimes counted his breaths during a difficult negotiation, a habit that kept his mind from racing ahead into anger before he was ready for it. Amara's small hand stayed locked around two of his fingers, and he could feel her trembling, even though she stopped crying somewhere in the last minute. He told himself that whatever happened next outside those doors, the most important thing was that she stay close and stay calm. Everything else could be sorted out afterward. Deborah watched him go with her arms crossed, apparently satisfied that the matter had been handled correctly, entirely unaware that the man walking toward the exit held more influence over her branch's future than she could have imagined 10 minutes earlier. At that exact moment, the door swung open, and Charles Whitfield walked in, a leather briefcase in one hand, the unhurried posture of a man expecting an uneventful late-afternoon meeting. Charles was a regional president for the Northern Division of Continental Trust Bank, and he had come to the Millbrook branch specifically to meet Marcus after hours, away from the attention a public meeting might draw. The two of them were finalizing a deal worth $750 million between the bank and Reed Capital Partners, a deal that had been months in the making and was scheduled to close within the week. Charles took 2 steps inside before he understood exactly what he was looking at. Marcus Reed, the man he'd been preparing to meet for the better part of an hour, stood with security guard's hand on his shoulder while his daughter clung to his side in tears. Scraps of paper lay scattered across the floor near his feet, and Charles didn't need anyone to explain what they had once been. His briefcase slipped out his hand and landed with a heavy thud against the tile. For a moment, he simply stood there, processing the distance between the meeting he'd walked in expecting and the scene actually unfolding in front of him, his eyes moving from the torn paper to Amara's tear-streaked face and then to Marcus himself. Then he said the 4 words that changed the entire temperature of the room. "Mr. Reed, what happened here?" His voice carried across the lobby with an authority that made every head turn at once. Owen released Marcus's arm immediately, stepping back as though the shoulder he'd been holding had suddenly become something he had no right to touch. Deborah moved toward Charles and began explaining quickly that she had just prevented what she believed was a $5 million fraud attempt. Charles looked at her for a long moment before asking, flatly, whether she had any idea who the man standing in front of her actually was. Deborah opened her mouth to answer, then closed it again, clearly realizing for the first time that the question was not rhetorical. She glanced at Marcus, then at Amara, then back at Charles, searching for some version of the last 10 minutes that might still make sense in light of what was happening. Around the lobby, the customers who had spent the last several minutes recording a supposed criminal lowered their phones just enough to exchange confused glances with one another. A woman near the entrance whispered a man beside her, asking if this meant the whole thing had been some kind of misunderstanding. Nobody answered her, because nobody yet understood exactly how large that misunderstanding actually was. In front of every customer still in the lobby, Charles explained that Marcus Reed was a founder of Reed Capital Partners, one of the largest institutional clients the bank currently held. He explained that Reed Capital was in the final stages of a $750 million agreement with Continental Trust, and that Marcus was the only person with the authority to approve or walk away from that deal. The $5 million check, he added, was entirely legitimate. The issuing bank had sent confirmation early that same morning, a confirmation Deborah had never once bothered to check before deciding what she believed about the man standing at her counter. Charles then lowered himself to Amara's eye level and apologized to her directly for what had happened inside a bank that carried his signature on every branch agreement in the state. It was a small gesture, but was the first time since they had walked through the doors that anyone in the building had spoken to Amara as though her fear mattered, and she looked up at her father as if checking whether it was finally safe to believe him. For words had been enough to reverse everything. The customers who had been filming lowered their phones, though none of them deleted the footage sitting in their pockets. The tellers who stood frozen behind the counter exchanged uneasy glances, some suddenly finding reasons to look busy with paperwork instead of meeting anyone's eyes. The man who had said, loud enough for Amara to hear, that Marcus might be using his own daughter to sell a scam, now stood near the door studying his shoes, making no effort to apologize or even meet Marcus's eyes. Amara noticed him too, and Marcus felt her grip tighten slightly on his hand, as if she recognized the voice even without looking directly at the man who owned it. Deborah straightened her blazer and cleared her throat, as though composure alone might undo the last 10 minutes. She recovered quickly, though, and rather than accepting responsibility, insisted that Marcus bore some of the blame for the entire incident. A man carrying $5 million, she said, should dress the part, or at the very least identify himself the moment he walks through the door, as if the burden of preventing his own humiliation had rested on him rather than on her. Marcus asked, without raising his voice, whether a customer needed to be wealthy or well-known before he deserved basic decency. Deborah answered by insisting she had only been following procedure, repeating the word twice, as though saying it often enough might make it true. Charles gestured toward the torn paper still scattered on the floor and asked her to name the exact procedure that authorized a branch manager to destroy a customer's legal property in front of his child. There is no such procedure, Deborah, he said flatly. There never has been. Deborah's face flushed, and she started to say something about protocol again before catching herself, aware the word had already failed her once. She fumbled for another answer and found none. She looked around the lobby, at the tellers who wouldn't meet her eyes, at the customers still holding their phones, and for the first time seemed to understand that no one in that room was going to help her out of the corner she had backed herself into. She could not answer Charles's question, so instead she pivoted again, this time blaming Marcus for bringing his daughter into the bank at all, suggesting her presence had made the entire situation more emotional than it needed to be. That comment was the moment Marcus stopped extending her any benefit of the doubt whatsoever, and something in his expression made even Charles take half a step back. Charles ordered Deborah to surrender her employee badge and her keys immediately, instructing her not to touch her computer or her phone under any circumstances. Every file and every note attached to her station that day would be preserved for an internal investigation, he told her in front of everyone still standing in the lobby, his voice carrying the flat finality of a decision that would not be reversed by an apology. While attention remained fixed on Marcus and Charles, Deborah quietly slipped behind her terminal and began attempting to delete an internal note she had added to Marcus's account only minutes earlier, one that described him as a threatening customer with a high risk of fraud. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, as though she believed the matter could still be cleaned up if she acted fast enough. Renee noticed a movement out of the corner of her eye and crossed the lobby before Deborah could finish, placing a hand firmly over the keyboard and stopping the deletion mid-motion. She told Deborah plainly that the note needed to stay exactly where it was, then turned to Charles and informed him that the branch's security cameras had recorded the entire incident from multiple angles, including the exact moment Deborah had torn the check apart in front of Amara. Deborah's face went pale at the mention of the cameras, as though she'd forgotten entirely that the whole exchange had been captured on film from the moment Marcus first walked through the door. Charles terminated her on the spot, right there in the lobby, in front of the same customers who had watched her tear the check apart less than 10 minutes earlier. Deborah asked to have a conversation privately in an office instead. Charles refused her outright. "You humiliated Mr. Reed in public," he told her. "You will answer for it in front of the same people who watched it happen, not tucked away behind a closed door where the consequences might quietly disappear." Turning to Owen, Charles took a more measured approach. He acknowledged that the security footage showed Owen had never used force against Marcus and had released him the instant Charles spoke. He suspended Owen pending a full review rather than terminate him outright, telling him the time off would give both of them a chance to look at the footage clearly before deciding anything permanent. Owen's shoulders dropped with something between relief and shame. "I knew something felt wrong," he admitted, mostly to himself. "I just didn't trust that feeling enough to say so out loud." Marcus, still holding Amara against his side, found he had no anger left for the guard, who had at least had the decency to hesitate before every step, unlike the woman who had ordered him to act in the first place. The police arrived not long after, responding to a call Deborah had placed earlier describing a black man attempting fraud and threatening staff. 2 officers walked in scanning the lobby, and for a brief moment Marcus felt the same tightening in his chest he'd felt when Owen's hand first landed on his arm, a reflexive bracing for another round of assumptions before anyone had asked him a single question. Charles tried to explain that the initial report had been false, but the responding officers still had to file an incident report, since Deborah's original call had already been logged as an official complaint before anyone corrected the record. One of the officers apologized for the inconvenience while taking down Marcus's account of events, admitting under his breath that the dispatch call had made the situation sound far more serious than what they were actually seeing in front of them. Marcus stood to questioning with Amara still pressed against him, answering each question calmly, even though the entire process felt like a formality dragging out a humiliation that should have already ended the moment Charles walked through the door. He kept his answers short and factual, unwilling to let his frustration bleed into anything the officers might misread as agitation. Renee gave her account of events without hesitation, describing exactly what she had seen and heard from the moment Marcus and Amara first walked through the doors. She spoke clearly and did not soften a single detail, including the moment Deborah had threatened to fire her for offering to make a phone call. Several customers who had recorded the confrontation came forward as well, handing over video that showed exactly what Deborah had said and done, from the moment the check hit the counter to the moment it hit the floor in pieces. A few of them apologized to Marcus directly while they waited, admitting they should have said something the moment the questioning started instead of only reaching for their phones. One 10-second clip, showing Deborah tearing the check and letting the pieces fall at Marcus's feet while Amara watched, ended up online before the police had even finished taking statements inside the branch. By the time Marcus and Amara finally left the building that evening, the video already had thousands of views, a number that would multiply many times over before the night was through. Within hours, the clip had spread far beyond Millbrook, reaching national attention almost overnight. News vans began appearing outside the branch before the sun had even set, reporters standing outside the same glass doors Marcus had been walked toward less than a day earlier, asking questions of anyone willing to speak on camera. Reporters quickly discovered that Marcus was a single father who had raised his daughter alone for 6 years, and that the $5 million Deborah had torn apart was meant to help launch a scholarship fund for children being raised by single parents just like him. Old photographs of Marcus dropping Amara off at school surfaced online, alongside interviews from neighbors who described him as a quiet, private man who had never once mentioned the size of his company to anyone in Millbrook. The contrast between what the money was actually meant to do and how its owner had been treated trying to deposit it only deepened the public outrage building around the story with every new share and every new headline. Commentators debated the footage for days. The phrase Deborah had used at the counter about people like him not walking in with $5 million was repeated across every major outlet until it became impossible to escape. Local news stations replayed the 10-second clip during every broadcast that week, often followed by panels of guests arguing over what it revealed about how banks treated their customers. A few outlets tracked down Deborah's previous employment history, uncovering complaints from years earlier that had never made it past an internal file before that week. Continental Trust stock began sliding as the video circulated, and the bank's board convened an emergency session that same evening, putting pressure on Charles to do whatever was necessary to keep Marcus from walking away from the $750 million deal. Calls came in from board members who had never once asked about a single branch manager before that afternoon, all of them suddenly desperate to know how quickly the situation could be contained. Charles spent most of that night on the phone fielding questions from executives who cared far more about the falling stock price than about the little girl who had watched her father accused of fraud in front of a room full of strangers. He answered every call the same way, telling them that the only path forward was full accountability, whether or not it was the answer any of them wanted to hear. More than one executive suggested quietly settling with Marcus before the story grew any larger, hoping a private payout might make the entire matter disappear from headlines within a week. Charles refused each time, telling them plainly that Marcus Reed did not strike him as a man who could be bought into silence, and that trying would likely make things far worse for everyone involved. By midnight, the calls had shifted from panic to strategy, executives debating among themselves how quickly a statement could be drafted, whether Deborah's termination should be announced separately from the broader review, whether the board should get ahead of the story with its own press conference before another outlet beat them to it. Charles listened to most of it in silence, aware that nearly every voice on that call was worried about the bank's image, and almost none of them had asked, even once, how the little girl in the video was doing. He found himself, somewhere around 1 a.m, quietly grateful that the decision about what came next did not ultimately rest with any of them. It rested with a man sitting at his own kitchen table 2 miles away, deciding, without anyone from the boardroom watching, what kind of justice he actually wanted. An internal investigation launched in the following days uncovered a pattern far larger than a single afternoon at a single branch. Deborah had a documented history of freezing or denying accounts belonging to black customers and customers with lower incomes, and previous complaints filed against her had been quietly dismissed by branch leadership long before Marcus ever walked to the Millbrook doors. Investigators found at least a dozen prior complaints sitting untouched in old files, each one closed without any real review. Employees who had stayed silent about her behavior for years suddenly found themselves being asked why nothing had ever been done. Some admitted they had assumed complaints were being handled above their level. Others confessed they had simply been afraid of losing their own jobs if they challenged a manager's decisions in front of corporate leadership. One former teller who had left the branch nearly 2 years earlier told investigators she had reported an incident almost identical to Marcus's, involving an elderly customer whose account Deborah had frozen without explanation. That complaint, like the others, had been closed within a week with no further action taken, buried in a file nobody had reason to reopen until a $5 million check ended up torn on the same lobby floor. What started as one manager's mistake was quickly becoming proof that an entire system had allowed discriminatory behavior to continue unchecked for years. Investigators pulled personnel files going back nearly 8 years and found a quiet, consistent pattern hiding behind Deborah's strong performance reviews. Every regional audit had praised her for keeping fraud losses at her branches lower than average, a statistic that had always been treated as a point of pride by the executives who reviewed it. Nobody had thought to ask why those numbers looked the way they did, or how many legitimate customers had been turned away, delayed, or quietly discouraged from banking there at all in the process of keeping them so low. One investigator, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Kwan, who had been brought in from outside the company specifically because she had no history with anyone at Continental Trust, spent the better part of 2 weeks reading through years of internal notes attached to flagged accounts. She found language that repeated itself again and again in different branches, different cities, different managers, phrases like unusual profile and inconsistent presentation. Bureaucratic language dressed up to sound neutral that had, in practice, been used almost exclusively against customers who did not fit a narrow and unspoken idea of who was allowed to be wealthy. Patricia's final report ran to nearly 200 pages, and Charles read every one of them the same week they landed on his desk, staying at the office long after the rest of the building had emptied out, the weight of what the bank had allowed to happen settling on in a way that no board meeting or stock report ever had before. Within 48 hours, the police formally closed their case, confirming there had been no fraud and no threat of any kind from Marcus, and noting for the record that Deborah's original report had been false from the start. It was a small measure of official vindication that did little to undo what Amara had already witnessed. Deborah lost her job and now faced the possibility of losing her banking license altogether, along with a discrimination lawsuit and a formal charge for filing a false police report. Lawyers representing several of her past customers began reaching out within days, asking whether they too had grounds to come forward now that her history was finally being examined. The state banking board scheduled its license revocation hearing for early the following month, and Marcus, though he had no legal obligation to attend, decided to be there. Deborah sat at a long table across the room, dressed in a gray suit far more understated than anything she'd worn at the branch, flanked by an attorney who spoke far more than she did. When the panel asked her to explain her actions that Tuesday afternoon, she offered an account that leaned heavily on stress, on a demanding regional quota, on what she called split-second judgment calls made under pressure. She did not, at any point during the hearing, look toward the small gallery where Marcus sat. When the panel chair finally asked whether she had anything else to add, she paused for a long moment, and for the first time since the day the check hit her counter, something in her composure seemed to genuinely falter. "I judge him wrong," she said quietly, not quite an apology, but closer to honesty than anything she had offered in the lobby that day. "I judged him before I ever looked at a single piece of paper he handed me. I don't have a good reason for that. I just did it the way I'd apparently been doing it for years, without anyone stopping me." It was not enough to save her license. The board revoked it unanimously that same afternoon. But Marcus found, walking out of the hearing room afterward, that he did not feel the satisfaction he had once expected to feel watching that moment unfold. He felt mostly tired and grateful that Amara had not been made to sit through it with him. The bank stood to lose the largest financial agreement in its history, and for a moment it seemed as though the entire branch might collapse under the weight of a single torn check and everything it had exposed underneath it. Analysts speculated publicly about whether Continental Trust could survive the loss of the Reed Capital deal on top of the reputational damage already spreading across every major news outlet. Marcus's phone did not stop ringing that first night, filled with messages from reporters, lawyers, and even a few distant acquaintances who had never once called him before, but suddenly wanted to know if the rumors were true. He let almost every call go to voicemail, choosing instead to sit with Amara and let the noise outside their small house in Millbrook stay exactly where it belonged, on the other side of the door. He had no plans to open that evening. His mother called him the morning after the video broke, her voice thick with something between pride and old, familiar anger. She told him she had watched the clip 4 times before she could bring herself to call, that it had taken her back 30 years to a department store in downtown Detroit where a security guard had followed her through 3 aisles convinced she meant to steal something, though she had never once given him reason to think so. "I never told you that story," she said. "Didn't see the point in handing you something like that to carry before you had to. Maybe you should have," Marcus said. "Might have made today feel less like the first time." His mother was quiet on the line for a moment. "No," she said finally. "It should always feel like the first time, Marcus. The day it stops feeling like the first time is the day you made peace with something you never should have made peace with." His father, a quieter man by nature, said less on the phone that week, but drove the 4 hours from his retirement house in Ohio to Millbrook 2 days later unannounced, and spent the afternoon sitting on Marcus's porch not saying much of anything at all, just being present in the particular way he'd always been present The way a man who had spent 31 years never missing a shift understood that showing up counted for more than any speech ever could. Before he left that evening, he squeezed his son's shoulder once and told him he was proud of how he'd handled it. Not the deal, not the headlines, but the 10 minutes in that lobby before anyone else had known his name. At school that Thursday, 2 days after the video broke, Amara's teacher pulled Marcus aside during pickup, her voice careful and a little uncertain. She told him that several of the other children had seen the clip or heard their parents talking about it, and that Amara had spent most of the day quieter than usual, drawing at her desk instead of joining the reading circle. Marcus thanked her for telling him and drove home, turning the conversation over in his mind, wondering how much of what happened in that lobby had followed his daughter into a classroom where she was supposed to be able to leave it behind. That night, he found the drawing Amara had made at school folded inside her backpack and unfolded it slowly at the kitchen table after she'd gone to bed. It showed 2 stick figures standing at a counter, torn paper scattered at their feet and above them in careful 8-year-old handwriting. She had written a single sentence that stopped him cold. "It is not fair that people have to be rich to be believed." He kept that piece of paper in his desk drawer of the office for the rest of that year. Pulling out on the days and negotiations with the bank's lawyers grew long and exhausting, a reminder of exactly whose question he was actually trying to answer. But the sharpest blow of all did not come from the board, the lawyers, or the reporters calling for comment. It came from Amara later that evening, as she sat across from her father at their kitchen table, picking at a dinner neither of them had much appetite for. She looked up at him and asked whether anyone would have apologized at all if they hadn't found out he was rich. Marcus set down his fork and looked at his daughter for a long moment, searching for an answer that wouldn't feel like a lie. He had no answer for her. He had been cleared because he happened to hold power that most people never would. But he understood, sitting there with his daughter's question hanging in the air between them, that thousands of other people walked into banks just like that one every single day without a regional president arriving just in time to call them sir. He thought about all the videos and headlines already circulating his name, all the strangers online arguing about what had happened to him, and realized that almost none of them were asking the question Amara had just asked at their own kitchen table. Everyone wanted to talk about the check. Almost nobody wanted to talk about what happened to the people who didn't happen to be carrying one worth $5 million. The ones who never got a chance to have their names cleared on the evening news. Outside, he could still hear the faint sound of a car slowing near their house, one of several that had crept past since the story broke, drivers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the man everyone online was suddenly talking about. Marcus pulled the curtains shut and turned his attention back to his daughter, the only audience that had ever mattered to him in the first place. For the first time since the check had been torn in half, his own vindication felt entirely hollow to him. He sat with that feeling long after Amara had gone quiet, staring at the last uneaten pieces of food on her plate. He reached over and squeezed her hand, unable to give her the honest answer she deserved, and unable to stop thinking about what he might do instead. That night, long after Amara had finally fallen asleep, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table with a legal pad in front of him, the same table where his daughter had asked him a question he still hadn't answered. He began writing, slowly at first, then faster, a list that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with what happened the next time somebody without his last name walked through those same glass doors. The lawyers arrived at Marcus's house 3 days later, dressed in suits that looked out of place against the modest porch and the sedan parked in the driveway. They came with an offer already prepared, one that included a financial settlement, a public apology from the bank, and the termination of several employees, all in exchange for one simple condition. Marcus would sign the $750 million agreement as planned, and say nothing further about what had happened inside the Millbrook branch. They laid the paperwork out across his kitchen table, the same table where Amara had asked her question 3 nights earlier, and walked him through the numbers as though the size of the settlement alone might be enough to settle the matter. Marcus let them finish before he said anything at all, watching Amara do her homework quietly in the next room, while grown men discussed how to make a public humiliation disappear from the news cycle. He listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, aware that a single signature from him could still cost Continental Trust hundreds of millions of dollars and in more than one career at the top of the company. Part of him wanted to walk away entirely, to take a Mars somewhere far from cameras and reporters and never set foot inside another Continental Trust branch for the rest of his life. He thought about Amara's question from that first night, the one that followed him into every quiet moment since. If nobody had known he was rich, would anyone have apologized at all? He understood that punishing Deborah and pressuring the bank into a public statement would satisfy his own anger, but it would do nothing for the next person who walked into a bank without a regional president waiting nearby to vouch for them. He also thought about the customers who had stood in that lobby with their phones raised, recording everything and saying nothing, and about how easily an entire room had agreed, through silence, to let an injustice happen in front of them. Punishing one manager would not change that kind of silence. Only something built to outlast the headlines might have a chance. He thought, too, about Owen's admission that he had known something felt wrong and hadn't trusted himself enough to act on it, and about how many other employees across the country probably carried that same quiet doubt without ever being given permission to speak out loud. If the bank walked away from this moment having only fired one manager, nothing underneath her would have actually changed. The challenge in front of him was no longer proving that a $5 million check was real. It was proving that power, once handed to someone who had felt its absence firsthand, could be used to protect the people who never got the chance to hold any of it themselves. Marcus told the lawyers he would keep the deal on the table, but he refused the personal settlement outright, telling them he had no interest in being paid to stay quiet. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions that had nothing to do with his own bank account and everything to do with what happened the next time someone, without his last name, walked through those doors. Every branch would undergo an independent audit for discriminatory conduct, conducted by outside investigators rather than the bank's own compliance office. Any decision to freeze or deny a customer's account would require approval from a second manager before it could take effect. Customers would have the explicit right to request independent verification whenever a dispute arose, rather than being left at the mercy of a single employee's judgment. Employees who reported wrongdoing would be protected from retaliation, a condition Marcus insisted on directly because of what he had watched happen to Renee in the middle of that lobby. Frontline staff, including security personnel like Owen, would receive training on when and how to question an order that was clearly wrong, instead of following it simply because it came from someone above them. Security footage and transaction records could no longer be deleted once a complaint had been filed against an employee. Customer rights would be posted publicly inside every branch in plain language anyone could read while waiting in line. The bank would be required to publicly disclose how it had handled every ignored complaint from the past, including the ones already buried in old files long before Marcus ever walked through the doors of the Millbrook branch. And finally, Continental Trust would fund a permanent financial assistance program for single-parent families, seeded with the same money that had once been torn apart on a lobby floor. The board resisted at first, arguing that some of the conditions went far beyond what any single incident required. One board member, a heavy-set man named Gordon Pratt, who had sat on the board for nearly 2 decades, argued in an early call that the audit requirement alone would cost the bank tens of millions of dollars a year in compliance overhead. Money that could be better spent, he said, on shareholder returns. Charles, who had said very little through most of the call, finally spoke. Gordon, he said, we're negotiating with a man whose daughter watched the manager throw his money on the floor and call the police on him for depositing it. I'd like you to explain to me, specifically, which of these conditions you think we can afford to walk away from, and then I'd like you to imagine explaining that same reasoning to a camera crew. Nobody on the call had an answer for that. The resistance did not disappear entirely, but it thinned considerably after that exchange, and within the week, every condition had been accepted and written into the final agreement, alongside a public timeline for when each change would take effect across every branch in the region. Deborah's banking license was permanently revoked, and she now faced a civil rights lawsuit alongside the charge for filing a false police report. Employees who had helped bury previous complaints against her were placed under formal review as well, closing out a pattern of silence that had protected her for years longer than it should have. Owen was reinstated once the investigation confirmed what the footage had already shown, that he had never used force against Marcus and had released him the instant he was told to. He was placed into the very training program Marcus had insisted on, learning alongside other staff how to recognize and refuse an order that crossed a clear line. When he saw Marcus again weeks later, he apologized quietly, admitting he wished he had trusted his own instincts sooner, instead of waiting for someone else to give him permission to do the right thing. Marcus told him there was nothing left to apologize for, that he remembered clearly how Owen's hand had never once tightened on his arm, and how he let go the instant Charles spoke. It was a small distinction, but it was one Marcus had carried with him in the weeks since, and he wanted Owen to know it hadn't gone unnoticed. Renee was kept on and promoted to assistant branch manager, a new role that put her in charge of rolling out the teller training program across the region, all because she had been the only person in that lobby willing to speak up while everyone else stayed silent. Marcus made a point of thanking her personally before he left the branch that day, telling her that her willingness to say something out loud had mattered more than she probably realized in the moment. The bank issued a replacement check once the original had been formally voided, and Marcus split the money exactly as he had always planned. Half went into the trust, securing Amara's future. The other half became the seed money for the Reed Single-Parent Scholarship, a program built to support the children of mothers and fathers raising kids on their own, the way he once had. Marcus insisted that the very first round of scholarships be administered out of the Millbrook branch itself, the same building that had once refused to believe he belonged there. A place that had turned him and his daughter away, would now be the place responsible for handing opportunity to families who looked a great deal like his own. The first scholarship went to a 9-year-old boy named Isaiah Turner, whose mother worked 2 jobs to keep their small apartment across town, one at a warehouse during the day and another cleaning offices 3 nights a week, hours that echoed, though Marcus never mentioned to anyone, almost exactly the hours his own mother had once worked. Isaiah wanted to be an engineer. He had built a working model bridge out of popsicle sticks for a science fair the year before that held 4 times its own weight before it finally gave way. And his teacher had written on the entry form that he was the kind of kid who asked questions nobody else in the class had thought to ask yet. His mother, a soft-spoken woman named Yvonne Turner, cried in the branch lobby when Renee called her name and explained what the scholarship covered. Not just tuition assistance, but tutoring, testing fees, and a laptop for schoolwork that Isaiah had been sharing with 2 siblings on a rotating schedule that never quite gave him enough time to finish his homework properly. "I don't know how to thank you," Yvonne said to Marcus, her voice unsteady. "You don't have to thank me," Marcus told her. "Just make sure he knows somebody believed in him before he ever had to prove it. That's the only part that matters." Isaiah, standing beside his mother in a shirt clearly reserved for special occasions, looked up at Marcus with particular seriousness children sometimes carry when they sense an adult conversation has more weight to it than they can fully name yet. "Are you the guy from the news?" he asked. Marcus crouched down to his level, the same way he crouched for Amara whenever a conversation needed to happen eye to eye instead of from a height that made a kid feel small. "I'm just a dad," he said. "Same as your mom's just a mom. We both just happened to end up somewhere people were watching that day." Isaiah considered that answer with the same seriousness he'd asked the question with, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and asked if the scholarship meant he could keep the laptop even after he graduated. Marcus laughed, the first easy laugh he'd allowed himself in weeks, and told him yes, the laptop was his to keep, bridges and all. A month after the story broke, a national morning show producer reached out asking Marcus to appear for a sit-down interview. He turned down 11 similar requests before that one, unwilling to turn Amara's fear into content for a news cycle that would move on within a week regardless of what he said. He agreed to the 12th only because the producer promised, in writing, that Amara would never be shown on camera or named in the segment, and because the show's host, a woman named Danielle Ferris, had a reputation for asking questions that actually mattered instead of ones designed only to generate a clip. The interview ran 12 minutes, most of it about the policy changes rather than the incident itself. exactly the way Marcus had insisted it would be before he agreed to sit in the chair. Near the end, Ferris asked him the question he had been expecting since the producer's first phone call. A lot of people watching that video, she said, noticed the moment everything changed. The moment your regional president walked in and everyone suddenly treated you differently. Some people are calling it the Sir moment. What do you want people to take from that? Exactly. Marcus was quiet for a moment before answering, choosing his words the same careful way he chose them for Amara, because he understood that whatever he said next would likely outlive the news cycle entirely. I want people to understand that moment shouldn't exist, he said, not because a powerful person walked in and vouched for me, because nobody should need somebody like that walking through the door before they get treated like a human being. My daughter watched a room full of strangers decide, together, without a single one of them saying it out loud, that her father didn't deserve 5 minutes of basic patience. That's not a story about one bad manager. That's a story about what a whole room is willing to let happen, quietly, when nobody thinks anyone important is watching. Ferris let the silence sit for a moment before asking her final question, whether he thought the changes he'd fought for would actually last once the cameras moved on to the next story. I don't know, Marcus admitted, but I know my daughter is watching to see if they do, and that matters more to me than whether anybody else is still paying attention. 3 months later, Marcus and Amara walked back through those same glass doors. He still drove the same sedan and wore the same jacket, unwilling to change anything about himself simply because the world had briefly decided his appearance mattered more than it should have. Amara held his hand the same way she had that first afternoon, though there was nothing tense in her grip this time, only the easy comfort of a child walking beside her father on an ordinary errand. The bank, however, looked different in ways that went beyond fresh paint or new signage. An employee greeted them the moment they stepped inside, asking how she could help before either of them had said a word. Nobody's eyes lingered on Marcus's coat or his car keys before deciding how he should be treated. And for the first time since that first visit, Amara did not ask why nobody was helping them yet. A new placard stood near the entrance listing every customer's rights in plain language, along with a number for an independent complaint line that had nothing to do with the branch itself. Renee came over to greet them in her new role, mentioning that the first round of staff training had already rolled out across the entire region, and that early feedback from other branches had been better than anyone expected. Owen stood near the door in his uniform, and when he caught sight of Marcus, he offered a small, genuine nod, a far cry from the tense hesitation Marcus remembered from 3 months earlier. None of the customers who had once stood filming with their phones raised ever came back to that branch again, and Marcus noticed their absence without needing to say anything about it, understanding that some kinds of silence simply chose to stay hidden rather than be confronted. A small plaque near the wall bore the name of the new scholarship fund. At one counter, a young mother was opening her son's first savings account. Met with none of the suspicion Marcus and Amara had faced that same afternoon 3 months earlier. Nobody questioned whether she belonged there. Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that the independent complaint line Marcus had insisted on had already been used 11 times across the region in its first month, and that 4 of those complaints had led to real, documented corrections, including one case at a branch 2 hours south, where a manager had nearly denied a large business loan to a Vietnamese restaurant owner over what the internal notes had vaguely called concerns about the applicant's documentation. The new second approval requirement had caught it before the denial ever went through, and the loan had closed the following week. Marcus asked if the restaurant owner ever found out how close the loan had come to being denied for no real reason at all. Renee shook her head. No, she said. He just got approved on time, the way he should have from the start. Sometimes that's the whole point. The person never has to know how close it came to going the other way. Marcus thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, the quiet, invisible kind of justice that didn't make headlines or get replayed on the evening news, the kind that simply meant one fewer family had to sit in a lobby wondering whether they'd done something wrong just by walking through the door. Amara watched the scene for a long moment before turning to her father and asking if that was the reason he hadn't simply closed the bank down after everything that happened. Marcus thought about it before answering, choosing his words carefully because he wanted her to actually understand them rather than simply hear them. Closing a door is easy, he told her. Making it open for everyone is harder. Amara nodded slowly, the way she did when she was turning an idea over in her mind rather than simply accepting it. She looked back at the young mother at the counter, then up at her father again, as if measuring the distance between the fears she remembered from 3 months earlier and the calm she was watching unfold in front of her now. Before they left, Marcus let Amara hand that week's scholarship letter to another young student from the program, a girl a little older than Amara, being raised by her father alone, watching his daughter's face as she understood. Maybe for the first time, that $5 million had never been what made him matter. What mattered was that he had the power to seek revenge, and chose instead to make sure the next person through those doors would be treated like they belonged there from the start. Father and daughter walked out together, finally continuing the plans that had been interrupted 3 months earlier. A stop at the bookstore, then dinner at the diner on 5th Street, where the grilled cheese still came cut into triangles instead of squares, because some things Marcus had decided were worth keeping exactly the way they'd always been. That evening, sitting in their usual booth by the window, Amara looked up from her plate with the same serious expression she'd worn the night she asked her hardest question. "Dad," she said, "do you think that lady learned anything?" Marcus considered the question honestly, the way he tried to consider all of Amara's questions, because he had learned a long time ago that children ask the ones adults were often too tired or too afraid to ask themselves. "I don't know if she did," he said finally, "but a lot of other people did. That matters more in the end." Amara nodded, satisfied with the answer in the way only a child can be, and went back to her grilled cheese, the whole enormous ordeal of the last 3 months already settling somewhere behind her the way big things eventually settle for kids who are lucky enough to have a parent steady enough to carry the weight of it first. Marcus watched her eat, watched the evening light slant gold to the diner window, and thought, not for the first time, about how close the whole afternoon had come going a very different way. A different regional president, a later meeting, a bank without cameras in the right corners. He knew, sitting there, that he had been lucky in ways thousands of other fathers walking into thousands of other banks that same week had not been. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself the night Amara asked a question, that luck alone would not be the only thing standing between the next family and a room full of raised phones and lowered eyes. He had built something out of that promise now, small compared to the size of the company, but larger, he suspected, than anything else he'd built in his life. Not because it made headlines, because it might mean some other little girl in some other lobby on some other ordinary Tuesday afternoon never had to learn what Amara had learned that day. A year later, almost a week, Marcus found himself back at that same corner booth on 5th Street, waiting for Amara to finish her math homework before their food arrived, the diner's evening rush winding down around them the same unhurried way it always had. Amara, older now by a year, and by more than that in the quiet ways children grow when a hard thing happens early enough in their lives to shape rather than break them, looked up from her workbook with a question that had nothing to do with fractions. "Dad," she said, "do you think about that day still? The bank day?" Marcus considered the question honestly, the way he tried to answer all of hers. "Sometimes," he said, "not as much as I used to. Mostly I think about the good parts now. Isaiah and his bridge. Renee getting her promotion. That woman at the counter, who wouldn't sit back down when Mrs. Voss told her to. Amara tilted her head. I don't remember her. You wouldn't have, Marcus said. She didn't do anything loud. She just wouldn't look away, even for a second. Sometimes that's the whole thing right there, not looking away. Amara thought about that the way she thought about most things, turning it over slowly before setting it down somewhere she could find again later. Then she went back to her homework, and Marcus went back to watching the evening light change color through the window, grateful, in a way he rarely let himself sit with fully, for an ordinary Tuesday that had, against every reasonable expectation, turned into something worth being grateful for. If you had been standing in that lobby when it all began, would you have stayed silent behind a raised phone, Or would you have been the first person to stand up for a father and his daughter? A person should never need $5 million to be treated with basic respect. Marcus Reed did not win the day Deborah's boss recognized him as a powerful investor standing in his own branch. The real victory only arrived once he used that same power to make sure the next person walking through those doors will be treated fairly, no matter who they were, what they wore, or how much money they happened to be carrying with them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more, and carry that same lesson with you the next time you're standing in a room where someone else is quietly being underestimated.